It's about 1 o'clock, so I don't know what's coming in behind us, if anything, so maybe we ought to just get started. Thanks a lot for coming out. I'll try to get quickly to introducing Ben, and I guess I'll just begin with stating something obvious, and that is that crowdsourcing is not, in fact, new. In the 19th century, great scholars produced, for example, just to pick one of many, great volumes containing great many editions of inscriptions carved on stone in Greek and Latin throughout the ancient world. Tens of thousands of these things they published in relatively short order. What in fact this meant was sending armies of undergrads and grad students and other forms of indentured labor out into the field to transcribe these materials so that the great professor could put his name on the masthead and publish the book. They didn't call this crowdsourcing, though in fact that's what it was. They also didn't call this exploitation, which isn't surprising, but neither do we, and that's a little bit surprising. Well, whether for good or ill, professors no longer, at least on the humanities side for sure, the only part of the world I know about, no longer can call on armies of indentured junior scholars to go out and do this kind of work for them, or tour their own, I should say. And thanks to the work of innovators like Ben Brumfield, who is not the guy who is a reporter for CNN, we're now not only able to collaborate with ambitious and intelligent and highly active amateur transcribers and editors, but we're actually able to give them the credit for the work that they do, which is a step up from the tradition we've inherited. And more importantly, we're able to start changing the broader culture that sees this kind of work as mere labor, and rather than valuable and meaningful contributions to the sum of knowledge. Ben Brumfield took his BA in computer science and linguistics. This must be a double major in languages from Rice University in 1997. He's been a professional software developer since then. For about the last 8 years or so, he's been developing an application that some of you may have seen called From the Page, getting more and more into the digital humanities space and the crowdsourcing space, particularly with regard to transcription and amateur edition making, which we'll talk about today. The term of art for this is, of course, seeing the light, or seeing less of the dark, I guess. So that's the last 8 years. For the last 30 hours, he's been locked up in our space down the hall, helping to set up From the Page install here locally, which we've already started testing against a really fantastic 19th century travel diary in the Rubinstein. And eventually we're going to test it also on a number of Byzantine manuscripts in the Rubinstein collection, which is likely to result in tears, crying, meltdown of both code and personnel will hear us. But in fact, the application has already been used on important drafts of literary authors of whom you've heard, military diaries, herpetologists' field notes, and punk rock fanzines. And so you think the next step up that ladder, in fact, has to be Byzantine liturgical manuscripts. And there's really nowhere to go after that. And likewise for all of us, there's nowhere to go but to sit before Ben, whom I'm very happy to introduce to all of you today.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Josh, and thanks to Duke University Libraries and the DC3 for having me here. I'd like to just give sort of an introductory overview of how crowdsourcing projects work and the kinds of things that I've seen across disciplines, across institutions, and kinds of organizations. For some of you, this may be very new. For some of you, like Lisa Gregory over there, you may have actually run projects like this yourself. So let's get started. So I'd like to talk about what transcription is. We're all dealing with problems, most of us are dealing with problems of digitization and the problem of computers being unable to read essentially to OCR handwritten materials. But there's really two kinds of transcription, two kinds of activities that get labeled under the name of transcription. One of them is one that genealogists in particular, but also sometimes natural scientists, call indexing. With indexing kinds of transcription, you're looking at structured data. Here we have a census entry from 1860 from a couple of counties north of here. It is structured. The goal of a transcription process is to extract names and other kinds of data from this text, and usually to create databases that are searchable. This isn't the kind of thing that you are going to print out and read in bed, right? This is something that you're going to want to have some sort of searchable interface to pull things out. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with this. Because the individual elements are small, you can apply fine-grained quality control to them. You can also quantify people's contributions and use that to incentivize or disincentivize if it's done imperfectly through gamification. By contrast, the editing approach to transcription is one in which you're dealing with diaries like this one, which is the one that we've been working with. This is a travel diary from 1849 from a Viscountess who was traveling around Smyrna in this case. And it's actually really interesting narrative. It's kind of hard to extract information out of it, but on the other hand, representing the entire text is really interesting and really useful. This is the kind of thing that you'd want to print out and read in bed. Normally this is done not through computational, you don't do quality control through computational methods. You have more of a traditional kind of editorial workflow for creating these editions. And sometimes you might actually want to print them out. So if those are the two kinds of transcription activities, let's talk about the kinds of people who are doing these transcription activities. So transcription, crowdsourced transcription as a methodology, because it's a methodology, has really evolved independently in about 6 different communities, all of whom feel like they came up with the idea on their own. So let's talk about those communities and the kind of projects they're doing. So the first one I want to talk about is libraries and archives. So if you are in a library and you have invested a lot of work into producing high-quality scans and digital facsimiles, you face a problem, which is, now what, right? The problem with this image is that no one is going to read it, right? No one is going to find it because Google cannot index it, because this is not text to Google, this is not text to Solar in your institutional repository, these are pixels. And transforming that into text that can be findable means that you offer a lot more value to your patrons and you can engage with people better. In fact, right now, a transcription project I'm working on, working with my great-great-grandmother's diaries, my top volunteer, the person who has done the most work this year, is someone who is unrelated to the diarist, does not live in the community, knows no one in the family. But he was doing a vanity search for his name, Nat Whitting, in Google. And one of the first results were all the mentions of a Nat Whitting in these diaries. He read a little bit more and discovered, hey, that's my great uncle, the diarist's mailman. And now whenever he has a bad day at work, he goes through and he transcribes the 1923 diary. He's just finished October this year, so I'm really excited. That's the kind of connection, this is the kind of serendipity that we get in the digital age through search engines of people making connections they wouldn't otherwise make, and they would not necessarily make through finding aids and subject headings and traditional cataloging practices. So the kind of materials that libraries and archives are working with, OCR newspaper articles, I'm not going to get into OCR very much, handwritten letters, again, they're shooting for findability, and usually the format of their transcriptions are plain text transcripts to be crawled by search engines, to be searched by their indexes in their finding aids. Okay, by contrast, documentary editors have also turned to crowdsourced transcription as a way to offload some of the burden, the initial transcription burden of this first step in the process of producing an edition. This is Transcribe Bentham, which is a project at University College London that is seeking to transcribe about 40,000 unpublished pages of Jeremy Bentham's papers. They created a MediaWiki interface that has volunteers who go through and transcribe his handwriting. It's really hard to read, and there's a really complex set of markup that that they are asking their volunteers to do, to record all the changes that are made to these texts. You see there are places where he's crossed through elements, he's added marginalia, and they're getting their volunteers to capture all of that. So what editors are doing with this, they are looking for high-quality digital editions, which means something a little bit more than plain text transcripts. And the format that they're usually going for is TEI or some even more obscure variants of XML. Their goal, again, where these are going to live are going to be digital editions and sometimes print editions. Okay, so genealogists. This is a register from this is a burial register from a parish in England that is being transcribed by a group called FreeReg, who I work with. They are a group of volunteers dedicated to putting the records of baptisms, marriages, and burials for England and Wales from 1538 through 1836 online, searchable for free. They've been working on this for about 15 years now, mostly offline, putting CD-ROMs in the Royal Post. And they've entered 26 million of these. They're only about 10% done, so there's a lot more to do. So these genealogy communities, they're again starting with handwritten records. They're again looking for findability, but they're looking for findability specifically for names and dates and places. So they're dealing with very structured data, right? Their goal is to produce things that can be found via their own internal search engines on their website. So they are creating searchable databases. All right, so if you're in the natural sciences, this is what a text looks like to you, right? This is an image that has been digitized from your collections. Now, you want to do something with this. This is an entomology specimen from the Cowbud Bug Project. And in order to make this thing findable, you need to record the collector name. You need to record what the specimen is. You need to record who identified it and where they found it. And then you can do interesting things, not only to increase the findability of the specimens in your collections, but you can also map the collections. You can look at a certain species and say, where was this species collected? Is that species still there, or has habitat destruction or climate change affected it? So in this case, what they're shooting for is analysis. And they're dealing with structured data, but they're dealing with visually very complex structured data. Let me tell you, that the legs on an insect confuse OCR software to no end, because they look like letters. Right. But the destination is essentially museum professionals and scientists who are going to be analyzing this data and producing it in scientific journals. Okay, this is ProPublica, which is a use of crowdsourced transcription in investigative journalism. Probably the best example of this was the MP expense scandal in the UK about 3 years ago, in which it was found that a number of members of parliament were using government funds to build duck blinds and ponds and other sort of personal things. So they filed their equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act request, this is the Guardian newspaper, and got millions and millions of scans of receipts. Now what? So they enlisted members of the public, activists essentially, to come online and flag these kinds of receipts, many printed, many handwritten. In this case, this is ProPublica's example of trying to track down campaign contributions and gifts in the United States. So they're looking at receipts for different kinds of things. And the goal is to direct the attention of reporters to things that they may need to do research in, that they may want to write articles about, that the public is really interested in. Again, in this case, they're dealing with structured data. So the world of free culture, specifically the Wikipedia world, but also to some extent Project Gutenberg, has also been working with crowdsourced transcription. This is Wikisource, the German language Wikisource, which is a sister project to Wikipedia. It's actually an offshoot of Wikipedia that was started around 2004. And they pretty rapidly started trying to do OCR correction. Because the different communities disagree with each other and have different policies, only the German language Wikisource started projects that allowed people to transcribe manuscripts. Everyone else, because of a fear that Wikisource's credibility would be ruined and turned into a platform for cranks to publish their own materials, everyone else required any kind of materials hosted to have previously been printed on paper. But the Germans led the way. Nowadays, the National Archives and Records Administration is collaborating with Wikisource in the United States to put some of their handwritten materials online, and there are a number of small archives in France that are doing the same thing with the French language Wikisource. Again, their origins are OCR because of the print aspect of this. They're looking for readability, and they are doing traditional digital editions. Okay, so if those are the institutions that are working with this, who are the actual volunteers who are participating in these projects? So this is an analysis that was done by the Portal to Texas History that I think is pretty representative. It certainly matches what citizen science projects have found, which is that your median volunteer on any one of these crowdsourcing projects is going to be a 60-year-old woman with a master's degree. Right? This is the core of your volunteers. This can be kind of surprising, but it turns out that these are self-selecting samples. If you're someone who's really worried about the quality of your contributors, this is great news. If you're someone who's worried about serving traditionally underserved populations, this is bad news. But this is the kind of people we draw from. There's some variations. Military history tends to draw more men. Astronomy tends to draw people who are a little bit younger. But on average, 60-year-old women with masters. So why do they do it? So this is a project, it's one of my absolute favorite citizen science projects, which is the USGS North American Bird Phenology Program. This is a citizen science project that is digitizing the records of a 19th century citizen science project. So from the 1870s up until around, it kind of peters off around the 1930s, the USGS encouraged bird watchers to send their observations of individual species and individual locations into the Patuxent Bay Research Center. So nowadays, we're interested in climate change. We're interested in habitat change. And we're particularly interested in, when do birds start their migrations? How does that compare with when they started their migrations 100 years ago? All we have to do is transcribe 2.5 million index cards that are in these filing cabinets. Well, so we have volunteers who are doing this. And they're doing it well. I mean, some volunteers actually have transcribed as many as 200,000 index cards on their own. It's really impressive, and they're producing some fantastic stuff. But the people running this, Jessica Zelt at the USGS, ran a survey of their volunteers saying, why do you participate? Why do you contribute? So there's some really interesting things going on here. One of them is people say this is important, and it's true. Right? One of the reasons people participate in these projects is because they want to do something meaningful with their lives, especially if you're a retiree. You don't want to sit around and play games all the time. You want to do something that matters. But the other thing that's going on here is they say love of nature, right? Why is love of nature one of the things that motivates somebody to sit in front of their computer and type up records here? Well, this gets to the immersive nature of transcription. If you are transcribing a document, and it doesn't matter what it is, this is deep reading. You are reading character by character, line by line. And when I tried this, I'm not a birder. I don't know anything. I'm just interested in the tool. But when I started transcribing a few of these prospects, I wasn't sitting in front of my computer anymore. I was with these guys, somewhere in a marsh in Minnesota, typing up the results of our day's observations. And this is a lot of what's motivating people intrinsically to participate in these. Okay, so what about accuracy? And how does the relationship of who's participating and how they're participating affect this? The best studies of this have been done by the Citizen Science Alliance, the Zooniverse project. And my favorite example of their projects is one called Old Weather. Again, for scientists studying climate change, the problem isn't pointing a weather telescope at some point on the Earth's surface to find out how the climate is now. The problem is that you can't point a telescope at the South Pacific and see what the weather was like in 1914, right? If we want to see how the climate has changed, we have to find out what the climate used to be like. Fortunately, most of the world's navies, and in particular the Royal Navy, had someone who every 4 hours would go make a weather observation. So the officer of their watch would come out and write latitude and longitude and time of day and wind speed, wind direction, water temperature, and air temperature. This is great. All we have to do is transcribe all of the weather observations and all the logbooks of the Royal Navy. So they have volunteers who did this. And in fact, they've moved on to NOAA's Arctic cruises now because they're done with all of the Royal Navy for all of World War I. So they got through more than 1.6 million weather observations with 16,000 volunteers who transcribed over 1 million log pages, right? Which means you have a mean contribution of 100 transcriptions per volunteer. But that's not what actually happened. This statistic is totally worthless. If you look at this graph, what we have over here is a plot with 1 pixel per contribution and 1 rectangle per volunteer. And if you see, most people have 1 pixel down here, right? There's this enormous group of people who transcribed one thing and then left. But by contrast, only a tenth of the weather observations are made by these 8 people alone, right? So they're going through and doing this hour after hour, day after day. It's an important part of their lives. Well, so what does that mean? So that's a power law distribution in which the contributions, if you graph the contributions by user, you'll see that a tiny minority make most of the contributions, and then the next bracket down make a fraction of those, and on. And we have found this true regardless of project size. I have seen this happen with projects that have 5 volunteers. I've seen this happen with projects that have tens of thousands of volunteers. So what are the implications of this power law distributions? One of the things that I feel like this implies and addresses is it addresses a really common objection to crowdsourcing, which is that the crowd is not capable of doing scholarly work or contributing to scholarly projects. They're not capable, they're not interested. Because you look at the person sitting next to you in a red light and you think, they can't do this. But those aren't the people you're asking to do. So here's some typical objections. One of my favorite examples of this was a scholar who was violently opposed to the idea of allowing volunteers to translate letters of a famous composer from German into English. All right, well, classical music fans, a lot of them have pretty good command of German. That would be my perspective. But he said, there's no way we can ask the public to do this. If you look, because look, South Carolina voted for Newt Gingrich, right? They can't do this. Well, this is a total non sequitur, right? That's not actually what's going on. Right? So what's actually going on is, with these crowdsourcing projects, is you're casting this net, a pretty wide net, to gather a few really well-informed amateurs, these well-informed enthusiasts who love the material, they know what they're doing, and they have no other institutional or organizational connection to it. And I saw this with one of the first collaborations I did with a library. This is the Zenas Matthews diary, which was the diary of a Texas volunteer in the Mexican-American War. It is held at the Special Collections at the Smith Library at Southwestern University, Georgetown. And I was working to put this online from the page with Catherine Scaller, who's the Special Collections librarian there. And we get the thing up and going, right? And we don't actually announce it yet. So we're going back and forth. We say, well, how should we craft the announcement? What should we do about help text? And meanwhile, someone writes in and says, hey, I'm really interested in Texas, and I'm looking for this diary from 1836. And we're all kind of excited, and Catherine reads this and says, oh, great, 1846, right? Here it is. And he responds, he says, no, this is not what I'm looking for, but yeah, I'll check this out. So, oh, sorry, right? So we go back to arguing about, what should we do about fonts and announcements. And he goes through, and in 2 weeks, he transcribes the entire 43-page diary. This diary is not in good condition. Okay, and when he finishes transcribing, he starts doing research and adding footnotes. So these are footnotes added by Scotty Patrick, who is a retired oil field worker with a high school education outside of Houston, Texas, who's gone through and looked at the people who mentioned in this diary. And he says, here's this person. He goes on to become a governor. By the way, he's my cousin. He recognizes the phonetic spelling that Zenas Matthews, this Texas volunteer, had of elements that he's running into in Mexico. He says, oh, well, this is actually a refined sugar. Right? He goes and he finds books that are mentioned very briefly and sends us links to them. So in 14 days, he transcribes the entire diary. He goes back and makes 250 revisions to the transcript because as he becomes comfortable with the hand, he goes back to earlier pages and says, oh, that was a W, I know what that means. This isn't just a straight through thing. And creates 24 footnotes. So he's really our ideal, well-informed enthusiast. It leaves us sort of with wondering what we're going to announce publicly now that he's sort of done. But it was a really neat experience. So let's talk about quality. There are really two different ways that these kinds of projects implement quality control over user contributions. And they go back to that distinction I was talking about earlier between the editing approach and the indexed approach, between the structured data that's highly granular and the free-form data that really requires a more humanistic approach. So I divide these into a QA process that is single track, which is used for editing approaches, in which you start with an image, a volunteer or a number of volunteers transcribes, produces a transcript, makes a number of revisions to that transcript, and then it's approved and published in some sense. By contrast, these other smaller projects that are happening in genealogy and citizen science have what I call a multi-track approach, in which you have multiple volunteers who are keying in the same information independent of each other, unaware that the other is doing this. So you end up with multiple transcripts that are then compared against each other programmatically and either merged or reconciled or rejected. So in this case, we have two transcripts. We check to see if they're the same because they are very simple single-line elements. It's easy for computers to do that without worrying about accidental differences. And then if they are the same, we can approve them. If they're not, we send them off to further processing. So to look at some examples, Wikisource. Every page in Wikisource goes through states. They start off blank. They need a transcript. Then someone transcribes them, makes perhaps multiple revisions, and says, this one is ready to be proofread. You have a proofreader who comes in and either accepts this or says, this needs correction, sends it back to the transcriber. It's again proofread once. A second proofreader comes in and checks and either rejects it or accepts it, whereupon the page is locked down. When every page in Wikisource of a work is locked down and proofread twice, then the whole thing is considered done. By contrast, Family Search Indexing, which is a genealogy program, which is asking volunteers to transcribe things like census entries. This is the tool that was used for the 1940 census, in which you had 1 billion records that were entered by volunteers. What they do is they present the same image to two people. Those two people produce two transcripts of the image. Again, we do a comparison algorithm, which is pretty traditional. And then the interesting thing about this is that if the comparison algorithm says that these two things are wrong, right? They're not the same, there's something funny, they're presented to someone called a reconciler, who is, an arbitrator, who is another volunteer. That volunteer is presented with the original image, presented with both transcripts, and then basically it is up to them to select one of them or create their own. So the interesting thing about this is, how do you find these volunteer arbitrators? When you've got hundreds of thousands of volunteers, that's a lot of staff work. Well, they have this emergent system where if you're a volunteer transcriber and you have either always typed the same thing in as another person, or you went to arbitration and won, then they say, you're pretty good, right? You've got a score of this much, we're going to invite you in. And they teach classes on this, they actually have full workshop sessions for arbitrators themselves, which alone. Another approach is the one taken by Old Weather. They start off with the same image, and they do blind triple keying. Originally, they did blind 10-way keying. So they're getting 10 transcripts for every single weather observation. They did some math and discovered that triple keying was actually just as good from a quality perspective, and certainly accelerated their processing. So in their case, they get 3 copies. They present them to a comparison algorithm. If they're same, it's great. It goes into their analytic database. If they're not the same, they essentially have the 3 transcripts vote. And if 2 of them match, yay, that one works. If they're not the same, they all go to further processing. So they have an interesting side effect of this voting algorithm, which is that if you're outvoted consistently, a secret field on your user record recording your quality is updated. So this goes on your transcript. Okay, so they've also run statistics on their accuracy. And I think that these are really interesting. So if you just look at the individual transcripts that are produced, about 97% of them are accurate. But that doesn't mean that the transcribers are messing up 3% of the time. In fact, the transcribers are messing up 0.3% of the time, in which there's something very clear, they type the wrong thing. 1% of the time, the actual original observation is completely illegible. There's no information that can be derived from that. And then the other interesting thing that I think calls into question this nature of accuracy is that just as many observations that are mistyped by the transcriber and are wrong because of that, that same number are wrong because the officer of the watch confused east and west. Mm-hmm. Right? So they observed this when they started geocoding and plotting all these observations of things that had passed all their arbitration and voting, and plotting these ships, and suddenly a ship ends up in the middle of Afghanistan. And, right, okay, north, south, plus, minus, so actual errors of the law. Okay, so I'd like to talk about a couple of specific projects to talk about costs and results and the components of their costs. These are a couple of my favorite projects, and they're very different. One of them is a shoestring operation. The other one is a project that has extensive institutional support and a 6-digit budget. So the first one is the Harry Ransom Center Manuscript Fragments Project. So the Ransom Center is an institution in Austin that's known for its collection of modernist literature. If you want to know about the Dadaists, you go to the Ransom Center. They have a whole lot of money to do collections with, and sometimes they end up with books that are not modernist, old books, including books that are bound with fragments of medieval manuscripts that were used they were sliced up and used for binding. So what they started doing, and this is specifically Micah Irwin, a junior archivist there, is that he started taking photographs of these manuscript fragments and posting them on Flickr and asking, anybody know what this is? What this came from? And in the comment threads, you have people who are transcribing and identifying what they are. So here you have Alex006 who says, oh, you know what, this is what this is. I went through and I transcribed the text. I did a search in Google Books or Google Scholar, and I found an edition and identified it as a fragment from that desktop. And he also says, I think the script is probably 14th century Northern Italy. You have someone else who is a grad student who elaborates even more, and she includes a link to places to find this. This is pretty impressive for Flickr comment threads. Here's another example in which we have 3 fragments that are used to bind a cover onto a book. And we have a comment by Farley Katz, who, if I remember correctly, is a retired rare book dealer, who describes exactly what each one of these fragments are and transcribes them as well. So, the Manuscript Fragments project has a capital budget of nothing. All the images were taken with a camera phone that directly uploaded to Flickr. Their software development budget was also 0. They had a Flickr account. At some point, I understand they paid the $25 to convert it to a pro account. But that's all. In terms of staffing, this is really minimal. Originally, this was entirely done as a volunteer project by the archivist, sort of in his spare time. He had no institutional support. After it started getting a little bit of press, the Ransom Center said, this is kind of cool, yeah, you can do this on the clock. But really, still pretty minimal. If you look at their results, roughly a quarter of their fragments are still unidentified, of which probably half are considered sort of unidentifiable. They're just too small, they're too faint, they're too damaged. Volunteers identified of these more than 50, right? Which is really impressive. They identified them on Flickr. There's something else that's kind of interesting going on, which is that other scholars started calling in. Now, they didn't participate on the Flickr message boards. They didn't comment there. But they would make phone calls into the Ransom Center and say, hey, I just saw you posted this thing. And in this case, they're using the same platform used for crowdsourcing, not participating in it, but using the same mechanism of distributing the challenge of identifying these things. As a result, they've got a really impressive following in terms that they've got an impressive social media presence, as well as going from having no manuscript fragments described and collected in their database to most of them. So this is Micah's comment about the outreach. And I don't know what the answer is of, well, how does outreach matter? I don't know. We don't know that yet. But previously, medievalists knew nothing of the Ransom Center because there's nothing for medievalists there. Now they're kind of on the map. In retrospect, I asked Micah, what would you have done differently? And he said that he really regretted not engaging with the volunteers more. And this gets to something that I always warn people about with crowdsourcing projects, which is that crowdsourcing is not about free labor. It is not about getting volunteers to do your work for you for nothing. We have this saying in open source software, free as in beer versus free as in speech. Crowdsourcing is really kind of free as in puppy. People will come in and they will participate and they will help you out, but they do it for their own reasons and they require some engagement with you. They don't require being paid. That's not why they're doing it. But you need to acknowledge their contributions and make sure the contributions you give them are important. The other project I'd like to talk about is Itinera Nova, which is a project by the City Archive of Liv in Belgium that goes back to, they have registers that go back to the 1400s that basically are a record of the city court, the town fathers. Someone goes over, I saw one that was, this woman is accused of selling leather in the market without a guild stamp on it. And she is sentenced to go on pilgrimage to this nearby shrine and is not to be admitted back within the city unless she has the badge, the medallion from that shrine. Right? So that's the kind of material. It's really interesting, but it's written in 15th century Dutch. So you've got the linguistic issue of Middle Dutch, you've got the paleographic issue of this being really hard to read, and you also have some interesting text encoding issues of additions and deletions that they want to capture. They started this project 3.5 years ago, and this differs a lot from the Ransom Center project. In this case, they're doing all of the digitization, and they have volunteers involved for every step. The volunteers are going through and evaluating the physical registers for conservation. They're doing some minimal conservation themselves, or they're passing registers on for professional conservation. The volunteers are operating a $40,000 image photography system right? They are capturing the images themselves. And this was, after some experimentation, deemed to be more cost-effective and higher quality than outsourcing the digitization. I can tell you some of the horror stories I heard about that later. Of those images, archival copies versus access copies are all created and reviewed by volunteers. Similarly, image problems are identified, and so some things may need to be re-imaged. And then of all of these acts, and an act may span multiple pages, or there may be multiple acts of these courts on a page, they've gone through and transcribed about 12,000 of them. This has all been done with between 35 and 40 volunteers, most of whom are local, some of whom work on the web-based tool from elsewhere, but they're mostly sort of there in the town. And they're managed by one full-time staff member and a sliver of the main archivist's time. So what's their budget like? Their budget is pretty big, right? They're paying for roughly 4 person-years of staff time. They're paying for a professional quality book scanner. They're paying for this transcription software and for developing a tutorial to help people learn 15th century Dutch paleography. They have exhibits in the town hall, and they've actually sponsored conferences on the subject. But the thing to realize about many of these projects that are these sort of tip-to-tail projects is that to some extent, the money that's being spent on imaging is not necessarily part of the crowdsourcing project. This is a criticism of Transcription that has spent all this money doing work that, if they had just hired the editors to do it, they would have gotten more transcripts. Well, yes, but 2/3 of the money went to making digital facsimiles. Well, should that really count? And it's an interesting question. So to wrap up, let me point you to other people who know lots about these. Mia Ridge is finishing her PhD at the Open University, and she is studying crowdsourcing and cultural heritage, not just transcription. She and I are going to be co-teaching a class next summer at University of Maryland, just in their HILT program of 1-week workshop. Chris Lintott speaks a lot. Doing a web search for any of these people will find videos in which they present the details of their projects. Micah Irwin, running the Manuscript Fragments Project, Melissa Terrace, Dominic Parks and Paul Flemons at the Atlas of Living Australia. So let me wrap up, and we've got about 15 minutes left, and ask for questions. And I'll leave you with pointers to a few URLs. There's my own transcription tool from the page. There's a directory of transcription software. The great thing about crowdsourced transcription tools is that there are 30 of them to choose from. The horrible thing is that there's 30 of them to choose from. So there's a directory of them at my blog. So are there any questions? I see one hand up in the back. Yes?
Hi Ben. I'm Liz Nowitz at Digital Scholarship Services here in the libraries. This was fantastic. One of the things that you mentioned, you said you felt like people should spend more time on connecting with their volunteers and really reaching out to them. That was what Micah had said, you could do it differently. What would they have done, or how would they have made a better or more long-lasting relationship with their volunteers? Did he talk more about that outreach? It seems to me that's really critical for getting the work done, but it's not really well understood how to get them and continue to keep them engaged.
Right. So there's really 3 aspects of that. One of them is finding volunteers. And one suggestion I've made at times is, before you start a transcription project, if you're looking at crowdsourcing a collection of bicycle photos versus crowdsourcing a set of Civil War diaries versus something else, is don't start with the digitization and the software development. Start by identifying online communities you can talk to, right? Because maybe there are lots of people, there are existing forums of enthusiasts of the Spanish-American War. Maybe there's not. You can find this out before you invest a penny. So really almost the first step is identifying ways to publicize this kinds of material. Another step is, if you're already well known, again, reaching out to your patrons who make inquiries, as we did with Southwestern University and Scotty Patrick. In terms of engagement, being there and answering. One of the things that the Bentham people will tell you has really hurt them is that they closed down for the holidays. So when the New York Times published an article covering the Bentham transcription project, Transcribe Bentham, on December 23rd, they had a flood of inquiries, a flood of people who answered, who emailed them, said, how do I get involved? And when they didn't get back to them for 2.5 weeks, they lost potential people. And the last thing I would say, and one thing in which I feel like libraries are very well suited for running these as opposed to some other kinds of organizations, is to realize that you're building these communities sort of organically. One of the things that really hurt the Transcribe Bentham people is that they were given a 1-year grant. They had 6 months to develop the software, they had 5 months to run the project, and then 1 month to write up the results. So they developed the software for half a year, they made their announcement, they attracted these really committed volunteers, and then after 5 months they said, pencils down. And talking to Melissa Terrace, they're really active volunteers. A lot of them felt betrayed and did not come back when they were able to get more funding and continue. Because they said, sorry, this is over. Whereas something that is part of an organization that can see this as multi-year, open-ended projects, or perhaps something that only starts off with fewer than 40,000 dense pages, something that's achievable, has, I think, an advantage in front of these.
Can I add to that really quickly? So one of the things that we've done is just spend insane amounts of time emailing with people about their health, about all kinds of things, as if they were our friends, which they become. And another thing we do, and this sounds a little counterintuitive, is sometimes we urge people to back off a little bit, to not get burnt out. And if there are bugs that we're working on in the software, we say, take a break for a couple days. Let us work this out rather than you get frustrated, because they're normal people sort of, like everyone else. And they can cross that line where they start to resent the thing that initially they loved. And so you just have to develop these relationships with them that can take extraordinary amounts of time, but it's worth it for the value they add. That's our experience.
Yes. Any other questions?
Just an observation. Flickr, as you know now, gives away a terabyte of information. So in the old days, when they had to pay $25 to get unlimited, any organization now, anybody can have a terabyte of space to load pictures. So it's gotten even cheaper.
Yes. Any other? Yes.
So we have to have everyone have an ID to vote because of all the voter fraud. There is no voter fraud. We can't let people transcribe our stuff because they'll screw it up or be evil or whatever. I'm interested, are there stories of malicious behavior that you can talk about? Or are there really no exemplars that you can talk about? And secondly, around that, I imagine transcribing weather or birds is very different than, say, racial issues in the South during the Civil War. And so are there any crowdsourcing things that are around what might be considered hot button issues?
That's a really interesting. Those are two interesting questions. To address the first, the person who's done the most research on this is Melissa Terrace. And if I can quote her, she would say, in her Scottish accent, it just doesn't happen. It does not happen. Fundamentally, bored high school kids vandalize Wikipedia because everyone sees Wikipedia. And other than that, they have better things to do. That said, there are comment spam attacks on my site every day. They're extremely naive. I require users to have an account in order to post a comment, and as a result, none of them succeed. But so it doesn't actually take any time for me. But other than sort of the spam bots, there are no examples that I know of active malicious behavior. And the second question, let's see, example. Well, okay, so obviously all of the all of the citizen journalism, all the investigative journalism is dealing with hot button issues. They have people who are politically motivated, they're activists, and that's why they're contributing to these projects. So I feel like that those are really powerful, and you might, I don't know of cases in which, political opponents have gone through and tried to mess things up. Could happen, I'm not sure. So, we'll see. Yes?
My question is kind of related to that. When you were showing the single track and the multi-track, I'm curious about if there's staging between private and public. Because in the project that I'm working on, there's potential for there to be arguments between people who are looking at the same artifact.
Right.
And so if that were contentious, is there staging happening in any of these different tracks you see where it then becomes public and maybe locked, or is that also then becoming part of the documentation of it?
So, a lot of people in particularly the archives and museum world are very careful about incorporating user-generated content back into their public presences. So those people will have a lot of this work be done privately and then accepted into an official place, even if the end users don't care about the official place. They care about their community of transcribers where they go through and discuss these things. By contrast, the people in the citizen science world want to foster those kinds of discussions. And the Zooniverse group have created a tool called Talk, in which they kind of graft this tool onto their transcription project so that if someone notices something interesting, they can discuss it. And they can discuss it in a way that is linked to the image or the images, as well as the transcripts that are relevant. And there's a second piece of this, which gets a little bit to engagement, which is that part of their goal is to focus scientists' time on those discussions that are happening that have the most potential. So that if you are a scholar who only has 2 hours on Friday afternoon, you go to Talk, you see where the hot discussions are, and then you can go in and weigh in, reward those contributors, those volunteers, with a dialogue with a real scientist, which they're excited about. You can also see the provenance of the contribution of the discussion, as well as of the transcript, as well as of the facsimiles that are starting all this. So there's, I feel like, a couple of different approaches that are, I'm not going to say at war with each other, but this idea of user-generated content is great. Let's just make sure that the authors are transparent. Is not one that's accepted everywhere. Yes?
You mentioned that you were doing one of the travel diaries. Are you just having transcribing that, or what's
Josh, do you want to explain?
Yeah, sure. We stumbled upon this by accident. It's a travel diary of Emily Ann Beaufort Smythe Strangford, of her travels through Greece and Turkey and Syria in 1859-60. And her husband's father was Strangford VI, who was the donor of the Strangford collection to the British Museum of antiquities purchased in Constantinople in the 1820s. And she herself traveled in the footprint of Greco-Roman antiquity in the ancient Near East in the, when was that book written? 1830s?
Yeah.
The published book.
The published one. The published one was actually 1860, I want to say. It was right after the diary.
So we have a published journal of her travels, and then we have here in Rubenstein this account of her travels in 1859-60, and we're only now 5 pages into it. But one of the things we want to see is how well From the Page works as a way of keeping the kind of value that library users bring to library materials when they come to special collections and transcribe things in their notebooks, and then walk away such that the minute they're gone, they know more about the material than the library does. But if they're able to transcribe, capture certain aspects of materials that we have via a simple tool that we can stand up, then they can walk away and do what they like, and we now know more about the thing. So we're playing with how well it works for hooking up people and places and times to sort of standard services that control them. And one of the things that we think might be pretty cool is if we can build a kind of visualization layer on top of the journal itself so that we can watch her move through space and see what places she's visited and what these towns used to be called and the extent to which, since we also have the published volume from archive.org, we might actually be able to see places where she has revisited. We don't know yet. We've been working on this for 31 hours now.
It's not a publicly.
No.
Sorry, say again?
Because it's not people, you're experimenting with it privately, not putting it up.
Well, the library has, much to its credit, put up a beautiful, high-quality digital image of every single page.
Right. It's part of the Bingham Center's
Yes.
calendar,
That's right.
which is why I'm curious about it. It's something that we could learn more about.
Yeah, well, what you should do is just come see us, and we'll give you the URL where we are playing with the transcription tool, and you can play too.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So you,
Yes.
you described 6 to 8 days with targets and different corpus each time. Is from the page archetypically one of those? What is your tool best for?
So my tool was built essentially for amateurs to produce their own print and digital editions. I created it for a set of diaries, as I've mentioned, that were family diaries. It allows people to do plain text transcripts, but also to use a pretty simple syntax to index terms of people, places, things like that. The people who seem most excited about that particular aspect of it are often in the natural history world. There are museums that are now looking from their specimens that they have back to the notebooks that were created by the collectors because they're interested to contextualize those objects and those items with the conditions under which they were collected. So very excited about that. There are other people, but mine is more traditionally for narratives, letters, diaries, journals, the actual texts as opposed to for extracts. Any other questions? I think we're pretty much out of time. I'm happy to sit around and chat with anybody. I don't want to keep people in their seats if they have other things to do.
Ben, that was great. Thank you.